Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I am Fabricio Guariglia. I am the director of IDLO's The Hague office. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this third session of the 2022 SDG 16 conference, which focuses on a new vision for the rule of law to address global challenges. In a world already struggling to cope with major challenges, COVID-19 has raised the stakes even higher and showed us clearly that the current status quo is no longer working. The Secretary General's report, Our Common Agenda, proposes a new framework to tackle our most pressing challenges. IDLO welcomes and strongly supports the Secretary General's call for a new people-centered vision for the rule of law. The concept of justice and the elements of due process, equality, good governance, and respect for human rights are at the core of the rule of law. It is this approach, reflected most prominently in SDG 16, which will be critical to the achievement of our common agenda. In IDLO's experience, the rule of law can contribute to delivering our common agenda in three important ways. First, it can help rebuild trust and legitimacy of institutions and help renew the social contract. Second, it can help to preserve and advance progress in the achievement of the 2030 agenda. Third, a new vision for the rule of law is also required to address complex and transnational challenges ranging from COVID-19 to climate change. Our discussion today is an attempt to build on these elements and contribute to the ongoing dialogue on the key elements of this new vision. We are honored to have an exciting lineup of speakers this afternoon who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience on the rule of law, justice, peace, and sustainable development. Let me introduce them quickly. We have Mrs. Ghada Fathi Waly, Executive Director of the UN Office of Drugs and Crime. She joins us online. Mrs. Tatyana Teplova, Head of the Fish Division, Policy Coherence for SDGs and Senior Justice Counsellor of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Mr. Aidan Eyakuze, Executive Director of Twaweza East Africa and Civil Society Co-Chair of the Open Government Partnership. Mrs. Maria Chiara Malaguti, President of the International Institute for the Unification of Private Law, UNIDROIT. Mrs. Yamide Dagnet, Director of Climate Justice at the Open Society Foundations. Mrs. Cecilia Ruthström-Ruin, Ambassador for Human Rights, Democracy and the Rule of Law at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Sweden. And Mr. Eihab Omaish, Head of the Executive Office of the Secretary General's Rule of Law Unit, who also joins us online. Later, I will also invite our discussants to join the discussions, and in this sense, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Giovanni Tartaglia Polcini, Magistrate, who is a legal advisor at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Italy. Mrs. Antonia Maria De Meo, Director at the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute, UNIDROIT. And Mr. Massimo Tomasoli, Director, Global Programs and Permanent Observer for the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance to the United Nations. It is now my privilege to welcome Mrs. Ghada Fathi Waly, Executive Director of the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, to provide opening remarks. Mrs. Waly, it is my pleasure to give you the floor.
Thank you, and distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to join you for this discussion on a new vision for the rule of law. I'm grateful to IDLO, DESA, and the government of Italy for inviting me. Fulfilling the promise of SDG 16 is essential to building peace and preventing conflict, to tackling the root causes and drivers of instability and violent extremism, to protecting human rights, and to achieving the whole of the Sustainable Development Agenda, from mitigating climate change to improving education and gender equality. This is the third global SDG 16 conference, and since 2019, we have seen the rule of law further challenged and access to justice further restricted in the COVID-19 pandemic. The resilience of our justice systems has been put to the test, now more than ever, as we face multiple crises and conflicts. When the law fails to work for everyone, it is the poor and the poorest countries who are hit hardest. The World Bank estimates that up to an additional 95 million will be living in extreme poverty in 2022, after 2 pandemic years, which reversed global progress in reducing poverty. Corruption risks have also risen in the pandemic, threatening state spending at a time when economic stimulus packages and social protection are needed the most. COVID lockdowns have increased risks of domestic violence for women while making it harder to access services and legal support. The shift to e-justice mechanisms in the pandemic has increased vulnerabilities in some cases, with more women than men excluded by the digital divide. When women go online, they are more likely to be victims of cyber stalking, online sexual harassment, and exploitation. Law enforcement and criminal justice sectors remain heavily male-dominated, with women accounting for less than 1 out of 6 police officers globally. As a result, women victims may hesitate to call the police, fearing exposure or being victimized further. The persisting gender justice gap has far-reaching impacts. Every 11 minutes, a woman or girl somewhere in the world is killed by someone in her own family. Research by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime has found that even in regions where homicide is falling, female homicides by intimate partners or other family members are not decreasing at the same rate, suggesting that the problem of femicide is not being addressed. The pandemic crisis has worsened these impacts and highlighted the need for renewed commitment and new vision for building the rule of law and achieving SDG 16. UNODC is supporting governments to take action, build on international frameworks such as the UN standards and norms in crime prevention and criminal justice, and the UN Convention Against Corruption. Working with sister UN entities and partners such as IDLO, we are providing legislative and technical assistance, supporting networks for law enforcement cooperation and integrity in the justice sector, and promoting human rights-based policing and equal access to legal aid. UNODC is expanding its support to strengthen the rule of law online through Secretariat support to member states to elaborate a new UN Cybercrime Convention. Furthermore, we are helping to use data analytics and advanced technologies to ensure accountability in public procurement and identify and mitigate corruption risks. UNODC has also played a leading role in launching UN common positions on rule of law challenges such as incarceration, corruption, and drugs. These common positions provide a framework for coordinated UN support, including through the UN country teams to member states, civil societies, and stakeholders and other stakeholders. We are further advancing this work with the development of a new vision for the rule of law, as called for in our common agenda, the landmark report issued by the Secretary General last September. Through this new vision, aimed at reinforcing the 2030 agenda through more effective coordination, we can better support member states to take targeted action. To give one example of joint action, UNODC and UN Women developed a new statistical framework to measure femicide, which was approved by the UN Statistical Commission last March. By providing a global definition for femicide, we can help ensure that victims are counted, that justice can be served, and prevention efforts can be more effective. Last year, UNODC, UNDP, and OHCHR also concluded the development of a comprehensive survey instrument to measure SDG 16 indicators, enabling member states to produce high-quality and disaggregated metrics on violence, security, access to justice, trafficking in persons, corruption, inclusive institutions, and discrimination. Overall, we have the global frameworks and commitments in place to achieve SDG 16 and strengthen the rule of law. What we need is greater political will and more determined implementation of commitments. To achieve an inclusive and fair recovery, we need governments to invest in holistic, people-centered approaches to improve the quality of justice ensure equal treatment and access for all, promote accountability, and reinforce the foundations of the rule of law. To do so, member states must invest in the full spectrum of justice, from education, data collection, and legislation to institution and capacity building, as well as international cooperation, in cooperation with civil society, international organizations, youth, and all stakeholders. This conference provides an important platform to broaden the dialogue, accelerate progress for the rule of law, and rebuild trust, including by feeding into the high-level political forum on building back better and implementing the 2030 agenda to be held this July. I'm looking forward to hearing the outcomes of this conference. I wish you fruitful discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Waly, for this invaluable introduction that really sets a perfect tone for our discussions and in particular, your emphasis on the importance of a holistic approach, including elements of justice, law enforcement, accountability, human rights, and rule of law, and the importance of developing partnerships. We're going to move to the panel, but before doing that, Mrs. Waly, I know that you have to leave, so we thank you again for your opening. And we're now going to, before opening the panel, discuss some brief housekeeping points for audience members. So those present with us here in the room, you will see that there are 3 conference floor staff walking around. These are Margot, Giacomo, and Julie. If you would like to make an intervention or ask a question to the panel, please call them over and they will put you down in a list. If you're joining us virtually and have a question for one of our panelists, please submit it using the Q&A function. Please do not use the chat function to ask questions. And when submitting a question, please indicate your name and affiliated organization. Now, I would like to turn now to our first panelist, Mrs. Tatyana Teplova. And Mrs. Teplova, your work at OECD develops tools and approaches to integrate the economic, social, environmental, and governance dimensions of sustainable development. So what lessons have you learned about how the rule of law can work to advance progress across the 2030 agenda? For example, advancing Goal 5 on gender equality, and how countries can promote people centricity in the rule of law.
All right. Thank you, Chair, and distinguished participants and colleagues. It is indeed my great pleasure and honor to be reflecting with you on these important questions and on how the new vision for the rule of law can help address global challenges and advance the implementation of the 2030 agenda. And my sincere thanks to the government of Italy, IDLO, and UNODC for this invitation. Let me start by saying that, of course, this conversation is particularly timely. We know that recently many countries experienced declines in the rule of law, and that there is also a growing disconnect between people and the institutions, and with justice systems in particular, rightly or wrongly, often being seen as serving only a few privileged groups. We also saw that gaps in access to justice have been exacerbated during pandemic, as was already mentioned by the great speakers yesterday and earlier today. And together with growing legal needs around gender-based violence, but also housing and employment, we know that justice systems at the same time were facing additional constraints driven by, of course, the need to comply with public health measures, often resulting in disproportionate impact on vulnerable groups, including women. And all of this contributes to the low trust of citizens in their institutions, including in their legal systems, as also revealed by the forthcoming OECD survey on trust in institutions. And of course, going back to the question, this has an impact on the achievement of the SDG agenda and each SDG in particular. For example, in the OECD work, we see access to justice and the rule of law as being critical to protecting rights or accessing services which are core to other SDGs, be that access to employment, be that access to healthcare, the right to life free of violence, or the right to education. And of course, when it comes to goal 5, for example, what we've seen in our work and in my other in my other role, I'm also leading the OECD work on gender equality in public life and gender-based violence. We see that absence of access to timely, integrated and accessible legal and justice support, which is based on human rights and based on the rule of law, can significantly undermine the ability of victims and survivors of violence to actually escape from those situations of violence, thus significantly undermining gender equality more broadly. And this becomes particularly timely when it comes to the situations of conflicts where women and girls are often disproportionately affected by violence and other violations of their human rights. And more broadly, we also know that there are significant costs associated with the inability of people to claim their rights and access to justice. For instance, the recent paper on building the business case for access to justice revealed that the cost of health, employment, and loss of impact due to unresolved legal problems and inability to access justice can range from 0.5 to 3 percentage points of GDP in most countries around the globe, of course, further undermining countries' capacities to achieve the 2030 agenda. And in this context, as this conference stresses, the pressure to act is more urgent than ever. And as acknowledged in the Secretary General's common agenda, but also as discussed throughout various events, including this one, but also the recent Global Justice Week co-organized by the OECD, Pathfinders, Open Government Partnership, and the government of Latvia. There is a strong need for transforming justice systems to renew the social contract, deepen democracy, and advance the implementation of all of the SDGs. And this should begin by putting people at the center of justice systems and moving towards a people-centered approach to the rule of law, which can also enable countries to deliver, in particular on the SDG 16.3 target on leaving no one behind in accessing justice. So to support countries in making this transformation towards greater people centricity, the new OECD framework and good practice principles on people-centered justice, I have a copy here for those who are interested, have identified a series of core actions, also as part of the OECD initiative on reinforcing democracy. Let me briefly mention just a few. First is ensuring leadership that is committed to a people-centered purpose and culture in the justice systems. And this can help facilitate a whole of state and whole of society approach to advancing this agenda. Next is designing all of the justice responses based on the empirical understanding of the needs of different groups of people, for example, through the legal needs surveys, including 4 different groups such as women and girls. Third is the importance of empowering people to uphold their rights by fostering legal education, legal literacy, and of course, providing opportunities for the engagement with the justice system in designing, but also delivering justice responses. Fourth is developing the appropriate governance infrastructure and environment for people-centered justice. And here we are talking about the basic aspects such as resources and capacity, sound coordination, and appropriate use of technology. And the final point is the critical role of data and evidence, which needs to support all of the planning, decision-making, and policy-making in the area of justice, but of course in all of the adjacent areas in order to be able to identify but also prevent legal needs as early as possible. So I understand that I'm out of time, so I just would like to conclude here and stress that the OECD stands ready to support our member and partner countries in making this transformation happen, and of course to advance collaboration with all of our partners. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Teplova, and thank you for reminding us of the centrality of access to justice for the rule of law, and in particular for victims and survivors in the context of gender justice. I would like to turn now to our next panelist, Mr. Aidan Eyakuze. Mr. Eyakuze, your work as a civil society leader and most recently your role as civil society co-chair of the Open Government Partnership to address global challenges has been to advance a common recognition of the need to make governance more open and more inclusive. Now, the question is, how can governments work with partners, including civil society, to promote the rule of law and build more participatory models of governance? How can we harness new technologies to empower traditionally marginalized populations, including youth, to engage in decision-making and access justice? You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you. And thank you very much for inviting me to this. In answer to your question, allow me to be provocative, but hopefully not offensive. I want to talk a little bit about attitude, a mechanism, examples, and a warning at the end. So here's a slight provocation. In order, I think, to make governments really work with partners, respect the rule of law, include more participatory, governments really ought to become more humble. But humility is not timidity. And I'm borrowing this idea here from the chief executive of Demos Helsinki, who says, governments, and it's been mentioned here, Tatyana just mentioned it earlier here, surveys are showing that people are losing trust in government. So government needs to be more humble. But what does that mean? Let me be a bit concrete. Number one, I think governments ought to be a lot more co-creative. Work harder at finding common ground in this complex constellation of challenges here, finding common ground, especially with their rivals. And sometimes civil society is seen as a rival, as a counterpart who is aggressive and confrontational with government. But I think government needs to make ground to arrive at common ground with their rivals around a broad set of goals, not a blueprint, but a roadmap. Secondly, I think governments need to let go a lot more of their implementation, devolve problem solving to the edges, to the coalface, to the front line, where really the proximity to the problem often comes with it, it brings with it some solutions, at least at some level. But they should back this devolution with financial support and also a robust feedback mechanism. Lots of dialogue, again, back to co-creation. Third, governments ought to listen a lot more, consult, review, revise these broad goals, and then go back to co-creation and do the feedback mechanism. So these three things work together in tandem. So this sounds abstract and a little bit pie in the sky, but actually there is a mechanism that helps. It's not the only one, but I think one which is quite powerful. And that, of course, is the partnership which I have the honor and privilege to co-chair this year with the government of Italy, the Open Government Partnership. And Tatyana mentioned it in her remarks here. This is a partnership of about 78 national governments, 76 subnational governments, with the core agenda of making government more transparent, more inclusive, and much more accountable to the citizens in whom it's supposed to serve. And there's a great mechanism for bringing these three things together. There's a co-creation mechanism where the government sits with civil society as co-equal partners in co-creating a national action plan to go forward. And I'm proud, I'll be proud on behalf of my co-chair, the government of Italy. They have just launched their own national action plan, the 5th, in March, and I've been having some great conversations yesterday and today with civil society in Italy who actually like the way they've been involved in making this national action plan. And I want to apply one particular, the first commitment that they make, and this area is strengthening governance for the subsequent definition of a national strategy for open government. And I have to say, it's the first national action plan I've read with a national strategy for opening up the government of Italy. For me as a civil society member, this is very exciting. I hope to export some of this to my own country in Africa. So these national action plans are great ways for civil society and government to collaborate together. So some concrete examples of how this thing can work, and to answer the question a bit more directly. In Italy, for example, how are citizens involved in monitoring EU structural funds? They've got this great website called Open Coesione, which allows Italians to see how EU structural funds are being used in Italy. In Austin, Texas, at the subnational level, they have included homeless persons on a homeless advisory council so that they can help solve their problems immediately. One problem that they had was where to store their goods, their possessions as homeless people when they went for medical care or for job interviews. And they found a solution for this, working together, something that I think city council people wouldn't do. In Indonesia, a final example here, they have every Friday evening a complaint mechanism. It's called the Yasinnan Forum, where citizens sit with leaders and police chiefs to talk about the problems that they're facing in this particular governance area, and local leaders. And this brings a lot more, builds that trust, again, that Tatyana was mentioning is eroding. So these direct mechanisms of involving citizens in defining problems, coming up with solutions, and helping to resolve them is a way that can really help work with partners, respect the rule of law, and of course, is a very participatory model of governance. Let me end with a warning here in terms of especially using sort of digital government. Digital government isn't necessarily digital governance, nor is it necessarily democratic government. You can get very efficient digital government and you're really tied in, you locked in digital surveillance and other forms of control. So there are many tools, mechanisms for involving young people, marginalized people in governance, in getting their issues heard and dealt with. But I would like, my warning is this: let us beware the Faustian bargain of sacrificing our basic freedoms and our basic agencies as citizens on the altar of digitally enhanced convenience in government. So I just wanted to leave it with that warning. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aidan. Lots of things that were mentioned that are going to be super important for our discussions: creativity, ingenuity, the importance of building partnership, of building trust, of reaching, trying to reach common ground. So themes that we have already been hearing in for the first speakers, and clearly we're going to be important for our conclusions. Our next panelist is Mrs. Maria Chiara Malaguti. And Mrs. Malaguti, you have significant expertise in trade matters, financial markets, as well as foreign direct investment as part of your work with UNIDROIT. So the question for you is, in your view, how can the rule of law provide greater clarity and predictability to attract investment and to promote inclusive and sustainable economic development, particularly for developing countries? So you have 5 minutes, madam.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Fabricio. It's a very interesting question. I'll try to do my best in 5 minutes, but let me in the first place thank a lot the UNODC and IDLO, and of course also the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, the Italian government. And I'm saying this not only to be thankful in general, but also because I think that having an organization like UNIDROIT here today shows really a new vision for rule of law, a real one, I would say. I'll try to introduce two aspects to this in answering the question of Fabricio, because on the one side, we all say that clarity and predictability in law attract investors. We have said it for ages, it's not new. And of course, legal certainty is a value. But what I think is interesting today is that we do have multilateral products that come out of organizations like UNIDROIT for the unification of law that have a value added to this exercise. Why? Because we used to say that UNIDROIT is a gentle unifier. Why a gentle unifier? Because the kind of products that we do in the first place are multilateral. So what you then implement is something that is the result of sharing of different views and different systems. It's done with the private sector and academia. So we always have products that take into consideration the views of all relevant stakeholders. What is the final product can be hard law or soft law, but even when it is hard law, it takes a so-called functional approach, which means you recommend the final goal to a state, but it is up to the country to decide how to implement and reach that goal. So it can be, as a product, a tailor-made according to the region, according to the culture. So it is, in my understanding, really a gentle unifier, because you really prepare society and build up resilience at all levels. And you have as a counterparty, as stakeholders, not just the government, but indeed all levels of the government, including independent authorities when this is needed, and indeed the private sector. This is one. And we know that these products do help resilience, because in COVID, for instance, we saw that we have a product, we have a protocol, a convention and a protocol on security interest among the many aircrafts. In case of COVID, all countries that had ratified that convention were much better, because the planes that could not fly could be used for security. So they became liquid as an asset. So, you know, there is something that helps in resilience. But what I think is even more important is the second aspect, which is in Fabricio's question, which is the fact that this kind of product not only facilitate investment, but do promote inclusive and sustainable economic development for the quality of products, for the kind of products. Just let me make one example, which I think is very easy to understand. We partner with FAO and IFAD on various products. We are now at the third experience on legal structures and for agri-food business, and reconsidering supply chains. What for? For financial inclusion, for better guarantees, for all what is needed in all realities for really development. And in parallel, we will start another project on investment contracts. You know, and I have no time to elaborate on that, but you know that investment law is changing now. We have new generation BITs where the environment, climate change, human rights are all taken into consideration in the behavior of the investors. That can be somehow reflected in investment contracts, again applying principles that are general. So why I really thank you for having invited me here, because I think really this is really a new vision for rule of law. The rule of law, which is not only, which is already a huge task, justiciability, access to justice, transparency, but it's really getting to the structure of the legal order and getting closer and having cultural differences, being able to dialogue in really a gentle multilateralism, which is something we strongly need at this point of time, I would say. That's enough, I think.
Thank you so much, Maria Chiara, and thank you for sticking to the 5 minutes and for this important presentation. And I think interesting to see how you look at inclusiveness, both from the moment of the definition of the goals and also the moment of implementation in areas where basically are in a way being developed in order to become more in tune with rule of law considerations. So for me, I have learned a lot from your presentation. So thank you so much for that. We have now Yamide Dagnet is Director of Climate Justice at the Open Society Foundation, and today is Earth Day. So it's a very important moment in order to have this presentation and to hear from Mr. Dagnet. Many of the causes and effects of climate change, as well as the actions needed to address them, are closely linked to issues of fairness, justice, and equality. So the question here is, in this light, what role can the rule of law play in ensuring equitable climate action? How can a rule-based approach empower vulnerable communities and ensure that the voices are heard in international climate negotiations? Ms. Dagnet, yes, so we have 5 minutes, please. Mrs. Dagnet.
Thank you very much. Well, the IPCC, which is the most authoritative scientific panel, has released 2 reports. And there, climate change is very much highlighted as a matter of not only social, but also economic justice, and also as a national security and global security issue. And this is also because the most vulnerable countries and communities who contributed the least to the matter, to the issue, face disproportionate impacts. So thank you very much to all organizers for the opportunities to speak today on the role the rule of law play in ensuring equitable climate action, and how we can empower and amplify the voices of vulnerable communities. You know, the first question that I have for you actually for this is, maybe next time we will see more of them in the room, more indigenous people, more youth. So this is maybe an idea, you know, to consider. I would like to stop a little bit and to say that the current geopolitical context for this discussion matter. The last 2 reports from the IPCC on how to curb greenhouse gas emissions and how to tackle intensifying impacts got completely overshadowed by the war in Ukraine. While we stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and many in the part of the world affected by conflicts, the decisions made on energy security are often quite opposite to the trajectory recommended by scientists and represent very often a backsliding from the commitments that were made in November in Glasgow. And those commitments were already delayed because of the COVID pandemic. The priorities, you know, for those vulnerable countries on issues related to adaptation and how to tackle economic and non-economic losses, damages induced by climate change need to be really looked at with less fear about compensation and liability, and more efforts on solidarity. The fact is, we need to be able to tackle multiple crises at once and have the mechanisms, regulatory, legislative, governance, financial, socioeconomic system in place to do this. Now the COVID, the war, now the economic crisis should detract us from tackling climate change and from the IPCC's significant findings and recommendations on how we can do this with this holistic lens that all my panelists, my colleagues highlighted earlier. So what I'm going to do now is to highlight how to overcome that fear a little bit and what we should include in our consideration. First, accountability. I heard this a lot. There are tools that we can leverage at international levels, at national levels. Transparency tools, to support the plan implement review cycle. And our colleague from OGP, has just highlighted that how important this feedback loop is. And it can be done individually for individual countries, but collectively. And within the UNFCCC, there's going to be a process called the Global Stocktake that is going to start to look where we are, where we need to be, and how we get there equitably. We need to have compliance and enforcement mechanisms, including the use of litigation tools. We need to have also protective tools and safeguards, including the Escazú agreement. Very often, we don't remember all those unsung heroes, those environmental defenders that unfortunately continues to die, and the number is increasing. So there's two questions actually when you look at those tools. Do we need a more coordinated matching legal response, for climate, establishing parameters and predictable resources despite the unpredictable nature of the intensity of impacts? Do we need to use actually more liability and compensation tools when we know how sensitive this is? Especially when we look, and not just towards countries, but maybe also the corporate sector. This requires awareness, capacity building for the judges, for the parliamentarians. There are also stakeholders to consider. And we need to also leverage more sustainable existing organizations, institutions like universities, statistical organizations. We don't talk so much about them, and they play a critical role. We need to pay attention to unintended consequences as we dash towards, a renewable economy, to avoid land grabbing, to avoid doing the same mistakes as we did, if we the dash to gas, for example. We may intend well, but we need to remain humble, as previous colleagues said. We need to couple accountability. We may have the right data, but we need the right communication tools to support this. So we need to mobilize the media a little bit better to really get the stories right. And not just the elitist stories, the stories from the frontline defenders. Avoiding being tokenistic. This climate issue is also an intergenerational issue. By 20, there's a lot of 2050 goals. We will not be all here, but our youth will be. So we need to really get them at the table. And I will say, just to conclude, it's very much about legitimacy, as we heard a lot, but about consistency. No double standards in our approaches, to different countries and to different constituencies. But I am here with hope, because a few decisions were made this year. The World First Global Treaty on Plastic Pollutions, or some countries in Latin America, for example, enacted rights of nature law. So having a more holistic view to move away from our extraction model, give me hope and position OSF humbly, as my previous speaker said, and hopefully forcefully to work in partnership with all of you to really foster just transitions toward not only low carbon economy, but resilient society with equitable, accessible, sustainable resources. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yamide, for this presentation and for reminding us also of the importance of maintaining the commitment to fight climate change and to have a multifaceted approach in this combat, in this struggle, maintain this holistic lens that everyone seems to think is essential for our approach to rule of law. I would like now to hand the floor to Cecilia Ruthström-Ruin. I hope that I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Is Ambassador for Human Rights, Democracy and the Rule of Law at the Swedish Ministry of Human Rights. Ambassador Ruthström-Ruin, COVID-19 has created unprecedented challenges for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law across the world. But its most severe impacts have fallen on those who were already marginalized, including women and girls. In your experience, what do you see as the critical issues to advancing the rule of law and promoting democracy worldwide? Are there specific actions needed to close the global justice gap, including to address the special justice challenges faced by women and girls? You have 5 minutes, Ambassador. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you for having me online. I would have loved to be with you all in Rome. And before addressing your important question, let me also thank IDLO and the other organizers, the government of Italy and the UN Department of Economic and Social Rights for giving us this important opportunity to discuss how to strengthen rule of law, which is, of course, an extremely important goal in its own right, but which is also closely linked to the attainment of other goals such as democracy and sustainable peace. So these goals, they are as important as ever, but the challenges that we face when working to attain them are mounting. So I would like to respond to your question on the critical issues by commenting briefly on the challenges as we see them, the need for a vision when going forward to guide our work, and thirdly, how we can strengthen concrete approaches and cooperation. So first, the challenges, and here I will be very clear. From our point of view, the decreasing levels of democracy globally is the single biggest challenge to the principles of the rule of law right now. During the pandemic, the trend of shrinking democratic space has accelerated. According to this year's democracy report published by the VDEM Institute at Gothenburg University, 70% of the world's population now live in autocracies. The restrictions imposed to stem the COVID virus have further restricted access to justice in many parts of the world. So as processes of autocratization continue in many regions, the principles of the rule of law are more frequently disregarded by those in power. Lawlessness, corruption, and violence follow. But the pandemic has also, and as several other speakers have already referred to, amplified the challenges to gender equality. Women and girls worldwide pay the price of increased cases of gender-based violence and domestic violence. And other special justice challenges that women and girls face include widespread impunity for crimes committed against them, not least sexual violence, discriminatory practices by rule of law institutions, and insufficient capacity and knowledge within the justice sector of a human rights-based approach to justice and of gender mainstreaming. So that brings me over to my second point, the need for a vision. Sweden is convinced that democracy is the best foundation for a sustainable society. In a democracy, the enjoyment of human rights tends to be strong, the principles of the rule of law respected, corruption levels low, and access to justice guaranteed. So the rule of law can only be fully protected if a comprehensive approach to justice is promoted, an approach that actively defends human rights and the principles of democracy. So reversing the global democratic backsliding is therefore crucial. The Swedish government in 2019 launched a comprehensive foreign policy initiative, which we call the Drive for Democracy, further sharpening our vision and increasing our efforts. And rule of law is an essential part of this. This initiative goes hand in hand with our feminist foreign policy launched much prior to that. So these two initiatives are mutually reinforcing and they frame all our foreign policy and our actions. They both take a concrete approach based on broad cooperation and on multilateralism. So as my final point, let me give some examples on how we also strengthen concrete action based on these policy initiatives. First, women and girls. Sweden provides extensive support to different actors that promote women's and girls' enjoyment of human rights and access to justice. We have a global strategy for gender equality, which provides financial support amounting to 1 billion Swedish kroner in this current period, stretching from 2018 to 2022. And we also provide 150 million kroner annually as core support to UN Women, and also provide support through country programs and regional programs. So one such example is a 5-year program to enhance access to justice for women in Asia and the Pacific. And specific focus is put on bridging the gap between informal and formal systems through women's empowerment. It is encouraging to see that more countries are focusing on the rights and situation of women and girls, and several have adopted feminist foreign policy. So from our point of view, more of this is needed in order to close the gender gap. Secondly, as an example, I'd like to focus on the separation of power, which is essential for democratic development with full adherence to the rule of law. We as states must promote an enabling environment for civil society and for free and independent media to be able to perform checks and balances. Civil society needs our support, and this is actually a strong focus area for Sweden. But we are also eager to cooperate with many partners in this area. We are a proud and a long-time partner and supporter of IDLO. Other examples include the International Commission of Jurists, Transparency International, and the Roel Wallenberg Institute. Finally, we need to join forces globally and make full use of our common platforms. One very important example in this regard is the Justice Action Coalition, where Sweden is an active member, and we see this as very important to contributing to raising the global ambition on SDG 16. So let me end by going back to the need for a vision, and where our common agenda has already been referred by several speakers, and where the UN Secretary General in this extremely important report refers to the broader aim of this Justice Action Coalition to put people at the center of our justice systems. And I think we all share a responsibility for that to really happen. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ruthström-Ruin, for that presentation and for reminding us of the importance of addressing discriminatory practices and discriminatory frameworks in order to deliver authentic gender justice. And I can help remembering the work done by IDLO's gender justice team on the issue of discriminatory legislation as one important area for ensuring that we can close at some point the gender gap. Our final panelist today is Mr. Eihab Omaish. He joins us online. Mr. Omaish is the head of the executive office of the UN Secretary General's Rule of Law Unit. Mr. Omaish, in our common agenda report, the Secretary General noted that in support of efforts to put people at the center of justice systems, he will promote a new vision for the rule of law, building on SDG 16. The question, Mr. Omaish, is what actions should governments, development partners, and civil society organizations take right now to promote a renewed, more holistic vision of the rule of law at national and international levels? How could a new vision help protect human rights, ensure equal treatment under the law, and build institutions that meet people's needs? You have 5 minutes, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and my sincere appreciation to the government of Italy, IDLO, and DESA for this invitation. I'm sorry I couldn't join you in person, and I wish I was able to do so. I find myself as the last speaker. This is very challenging to speak after very eloquent speakers who spoke ahead of me. So I will try to, in answering the question, to retrace the steps that brought us to here, to talk a little bit about the content of the new vision as we see it, as we started working on it in the United Nations here. And also to tie it, all of that to the two parts of your question, the promotion and the respect of human rights and equal treatment. As everybody knows, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development provides a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for all. It promises to promote the rule of law and provides access to justice for all within SDG 16.3. But many justice systems continue to underdeliver. In 2021, last year, the Secretary General presented our Common Agenda report as an action tool to fast-track achievements of the 2030 SDGs. The report represents our best efforts to address challenges we face. Yesterday, the Deputy Secretary General in her video message and her remarks said, and I quote, "Over the past 24 months, COVID-19 has caused tremendous human suffering. The world also continues to face many other issues, many other challenges. Climate crisis, conflicts, hunger, inequality, lack of universal access to the internet, managing new technologies, and many, many other challenges." Our Common Agenda report could be looked at as a catalog of solutions to these problems. A catalog that emerged as a result of ideas and views of governments, development partners, civil society organizations, thought leaders, and young thinkers that the Secretary General engaged with through a year global listening exercise. Our Common Agenda bolsters achievements of the SDG 16, including through the new vision for the rule of law, which the Secretary General announced in support of efforts to put people at the center of justice systems. The new rule of law vision, or we can also call the renewed rule of law vision, will build on SDG 16 and the 2012 declaration of the high-level meeting of the General Assembly on the rule of law. It will examine how our rule of law assistance can support states, communities, and people in rebuilding their social contract. A strong social contract anchored in human rights at the national level builds trust and is a necessary foundation for peace and progress. It is also vital for international cooperation, since bonds across countries do not work when bonds within them are broken. Justice is an essential dimension of the social contract. Weak security and justice institutions weaken the social contract. Distrust is fueled by people's experience of inequality and corruption. And as everybody knows, has the affects mainly and has an impact on women, and by their perception that the state and its institutions treat them unfairly. In this regard, and all of this brings me to talk about the way we look at the new vision or the renewed vision of the rule of law. The rule of law under this new vision can be a multi-functional tool. Serves as a foundation for sustaining peace, strengthen respect for human rights, support attainment of the social development goals, help put an end to the informatic pandemic plaguing the world, tackle corruption, help ensure gender equality, and to also be utilized for the protection of our planet. To achieve this, the rule of law needs to be people-centered, rely on international law, foster international cooperation, to dismantle illicit networks, transitional organized crime, corruption, and terrorism. It also needs to be forward-looking, flexible, and respond to the emerging trends. It needs to embrace new technologies and make better use of data. Development of the new vision of the rule of law based on these principles is currently underway. Our unit, the rule of law unit, with the other partners, the global focal point for the rule of law, and all of the other partners who work on this field are currently involved in developing the outline and the new vision. We listened to the thematic consultation that took place in the General Assembly in the last month on our common agenda, and which were mentioned by the President of the General Assembly in his opening remarks yesterday. These consultations included the views of the member states and the civil society. We look at this conference and we're so thankful to be invited to, as also another way to further inform our preparation for the rule of law, for the new vision of the rule of law. Despite being a backbone of good governance, peace, and development, the rule of law, however, is not the solution for all issues. It cannot be mistaken for a panacea. The strong rule of law is one piece of the puzzle of solutions that jointly lead to the fulfillment of all of the 17 social development goals. From the idea for the new rule of law vision, which came from a wide-ranging process of reflection, engaging a broad array of stakeholders, leading to our common agenda via consultations and the development of the new vision, we will come to a full circle. The United Nations.
Mr. Omaish, I have to ask you if you can wrap up in the next 30 seconds. That would be very helpful. Thank you so much. Apologies for interrupting.
If you did not interrupt me, I would have finished in 5 seconds, actually. So through this, we'll come to a full circle. The United Nations, member states, and the civil society. And will all be central to the implementation of our common agenda, including ensuring and advocating for a strong rule of law, equality, and accessible people-centered justice. The United Nations is here to support that process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Omaish, and apologies for my interruption. We are trying to squeeze a lot of speakers within a very limited amount of time. We're moving now to our discussion, and here we're going to have 3 speakers, very expert speakers, actually providing the reflections of the interventions that we have heard from the perspective of their own experience and expertise. We have Mr. Giovanni Tartaglia Polcini, magistrate who's a legal advisor of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Italy. Ms. Antonia Maria De Meo, director of UNIDROIT, Mr. Massimo Tomasoli, director of Global Programs and Permanent Observer to International IDEA to the United Nations. Mr. Tartaglia Polcini, we would like to hear first from you. And again, I will ask if we can stick to 4 or 5 minutes, that would be ideal. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Chair. Let me start by thanking all the panelists for their insightful interventions. The COVID-19 pandemic threatens to derail progress on key dimensions of SDG 16, we have heard. At the same time, we are now fully aware that corruption too is a permanent global pandemic, challenging our societies and economies. Recognizing the risks posed by corruption, the fight against it requires increased international cooperation and coordination and renewed global commitment. A new perspective of rule of law affirmed in the multilateral fora, let me recall, for instance, the G20, which I know very well, can certainly generate positive repercussions on the global scene. The results of the G20 anti-corruption presidency in 2021 are a good basis to strengthen regulatory harmonization processes and technical assistance programs aimed at spreading virtuous models. The activities of multilateral judicial diplomacy should be exactly delineated alongside these two main roads. The first one, normative harmonization. I think, for instance, what we have heard by UNIDROIT. And the second one, capacity building programs. Several of the panelists recalled it. What is necessary at this stage is a rule of law-based response to all crises and challenges, which entails strengthening the legal and policy frameworks, mitigating the impact of the crisis on justice system and justice seekers, ensuring that no one is left behind, engaging in value dissemination and consensus building, supporting a culture of justice to protect rights and dignity of people. I can underline, against any form of discrimination. Among the documents approved by G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group in 2021, the motto of G20 is leading by example. They are all devoted to an holistic vision of the fight against corruption, in coherence what was said in the introductory and in the opening remarks by the executive director of UNODC. Let me recall only one set of high-level principles dedicated to preventing and combating corruption in emergencies. We have distributed the document, which is in open source in a repository of UNODC devoted to the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group. The document emphasizes the increased risk of corruption during crisis beyond the pandemic one. In particular, it recommends, on one hand, addressing the behaviors of corruptors and corrupts in the phases of emergency and recovery in order to guarantee integrity and transparency of procurements without affecting the needed speed of procedures. And on the other hand, encourages international cooperation and exchange of information. It is worth mentioning that non-governmental actors play an essential role in the decision-making process. The article, the principle 7 of this document is a breaking one. This is the main door for rebuild trust in government, it is my opinion. And in this sense, we are trying to change the definition of the modality of this dialogue, moving from the so-called multi-stakeholder approach I consider of the past to a new, stronger one, the multi-shareholder approach. Let me conclude with two last key messages. It is crucial to remind that the rule of law aims to counter abuses of power and to build a new, legally oriented environment in a multi-level order. To create a new level playing field, exactly as the OECD, for instance, aims to do. The concept of the rule of law is and needs to remain distinct from that of the rule by law. The difference is that in the former, the law is preeminent and can serve as a check against every abuse of power, guaranteeing the equality of all before the law. In the rule by law, law may be used as a tool to oppress or discriminate against people and avoid accountability under the guise of formality, legality, and legitimacy. And this is a paradox. The Italian perspective of the rule of law is intrinsically linked to the fight against corruption. It is in line with the multilateral legal framework, moving from the Merida Convention. And it is inspired by the cross-cutting Goal 16. We are conscious also that corruption undermines democratic institutions, as stated by the recent works of Summit for Democracy of December 2021. In Coherence, as we have heard in the speech we have just concluded in the first part of this panel. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Tartaglia Polcini. Mrs. De Meo, would like to pass the floor to you now so you can share with us your reflections. Thank you so much, madam.
Great, thank you so much. And of course, I'd also like to thank the organizers, IDLO, UNODC, and Italy for the invitation to UNIDROIT to share our perspective as the UN Research and Training Institute in the field of criminal justice and crime prevention. Our greatest challenges related to today's theme, as became very obvious during the COVID-19 pandemic, concern how we achieve the rule of law. And this was mentioned by several of the previous panelists. Given UNIDROIT's expertise in emerging justice and security issues, I thought it was a good idea to shine a spotlight now briefly on the role of advanced emerging technology such as data analytics and artificial intelligence in the new vision for the rule of law. Rather than methodically collecting evidence and investigating one case at a time, we can now input large sets of data into digital systems and algorithms that will crunch this data at unparalleled speeds, revealing trends and results we never imagined possible. UNIDROIT is implementing a really interesting transformative project in partnership with the United Arab Emirates. It's called AI for Safer Children. And in this project, we are examining how artificial intelligence can be used to investigate online child sexual exploitation and abuse. And the results are really impressive. Large quantities of data can be processed rapidly. Leads and directions for further investigations can be revealed. Victims can be identified and located. And importantly, investigators who previously had to go through huge amounts of horrific pieces of evidence can be saved from trauma. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Facial recognition software can be used to rapidly process hundreds of thousands of images. It can also blur out the graphic details other than the faces. And this aids investigators to identify victims with much less trauma to the investigators. And this advanced technology is literally protecting and saving lives of victims and of law enforcement. So tapping into this kind of potential should be a key aspect of our new vision. At the same time, technology is only a tool. This is also something that was mentioned by one of the panelists. It has to be used in accordance with rule of law and human rights principles. And for that, the role of the individual is key. This is the human-centered approach in action. Human beings have to remain the ultimate decision makers to ensure fundamental fairness. Results produced by algorithms have to be verified by skilled professionals. And decisions should not be automated. They should be tools to inform decision-making by the justice sector actors. It's also important to remember that behind every generalized data set that's crunched out by the algorithms, there are lots of individual victims that we are here to protect and defend. The last thing that I'd like to reflect on is the effective role of public-private partnerships. And this was also mentioned by some of the panelists. These high-tech solutions, as well as the data sets that are entered into them, are usually the property of private companies. So it can be expensive, or in the case of data, it can be legally challenging for law enforcement to access them. In developing countries, governments may not have the money to purchase expensive private software programs. They may not have the hardware to operate them, and they may not have the internet bandwidth to process them. So fairness and justice are lacking globally if only the wealthy select countries can access and capitalize on emerging technology to further investigations and prosecutions. So the reality is that the digital divide is greatly impacting the rule of law. And an important feature in today's rule of law must be to find ways to bridge the digital divide. For example, by making low-cost open source versions of technological tools available to law enforcement in all countries, together with training and capacity building needed to make the best use of them to achieve justice. And at UNIDROIT, of course, we are committed to working with partners to analyze and test exactly these kinds of advances to contribute to achieving the rule of law principles in reality that we're talking about today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor. And we move now to Mr. Tomasoli, and you're also the co-chair of the SDG 16 Data Initiative. So maybe you can provide us with the reflections on the discussion of today and share any further insights into the initiative's most recent report, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and many thanks for the invitation to the organizers, and very interesting panel. I had prepared some notes, but I can actually frame them with respect to what has been said, because it covers many of the areas that I wanted to address. Well, the SDG 16 Data Initiative is a consortium of partners, and all these partners work in the three main areas covered by SDG 16, and they aim at complementing data from non-official sources to integrate the official data that are used by governments and the custodian agencies from the UN in order to monitor the implementation of the SDG 16. So I will make today a plea on the need and importance of these data, but this has been actually already addressed in different ways by various panelists. First of all, I would like to say that the pandemic impacted also on these data ecosystem. Let me quote the Praia group, the Praia City Group on Governance Statistics. They developed some analysis on the challenges on collecting and analyzing data, especially at the most difficult time of the lockdowns during the first phase of the pandemic. But more broadly, I would say the pandemic has impacted in many ways on the achievement of the SDGs, and in particular SDG 16. All the areas addressed within SDG 16 have been stricken by the pandemic quite severely, especially in terms of the significant effects on democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. This has been indicated in the recent report that International IDEA produced on taking stock after 2 years of COVID-19, which is based on the Global State of Democracy indices and the Global Monitor on COVID-19 impact on democracy and human rights, which was implemented by IDEA also with support from the European Union. But we covered it also in our 5th report as the SDG 16 Data Initiative produced in November last year, 2021. It is the 5th in the series. I would like to recall what has been said about the rise of authoritarian regimes. If you look at the data from the Global State of Democracy report, the 5 last years that coincide with the 5 years of implementation of the 2030 agenda have been 5 consecutive years of more countries moving towards authoritarianism than countries moving towards democracy. So democratization is in a situation of crisis, and also the quality of democracy in countries that are democratic has on the average worsened. So there is a democratic backsliding. I would like to recall what Giovanni Tartaglia Polcini said about the importance of distinguishing between rule of law and rule by law. And I want to stress that rule by law is associated with authoritarian regimes. There is more probability of respecting rule of law in the sense that he has highlighted in democratic contexts. This has proved also evident in the data analyzing what happened during the pandemic. In the Global Monitor, the impact on democracy and human rights took place in different areas, like, for example, the use of emergency laws, restrictions on a range of freedoms, the impact on personal security and integrity. This is an element that was touched upon by Aidan in his comment on digital technologies that are not necessarily consistent with digital democracy. And also the effects of the pandemic on women and minorities. Many of the panelists touched upon these, and access to vaccines. I would like to conclude by drawing a key lesson out of the many that we may actually draw from the SDG 16 data initiative. And this is that the combination of official and non-official data provides an articulate and important contribution to the daunting task of monitoring progress on the 2030 agenda, particularly in non-democratic contexts, where government data often suffer from a lack of transparency and are more likely to be biased. And in this way, we should address such challenges as disinformation in statistics, a failed call for peace, conflict trends, high number of displaced people, and improving data collection for evidence-based policy responses. This last point was mentioned by the panelists from the OECD. All of these may help rebuild trust between people and the state. I would conclude by saying that data are an essential tool for implementing a holistic approach to building back better. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are going to move now to the questions, and we have one question from the floor and one online. Question from the floor is Dr. Mark Brown, Deputy Head of School and Senior Lecturer in Sheffield University, I think. Sir, if you can make your question.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the panelists and discussants for their contributions. Throughout the contributions that we've heard the phrase stakeholders, shareholders, participants, and so on. And Ms. Ghada Fathi talked at the beginning about the importance of data and research and so on. And amongst all of the people we see around the room, we see many governments, international organizations, civil society actors, but we don't see much presence of academia. And I wonder whether the panelists and discussants would have any reflections on the capacity to integrate more effectively the resources that can be brought to bear by academics, not just in the North, but also in global South states where there may be a need to develop capacity to ask the questions that are the right questions for those places being asked by the people who live in those places. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Brown. We have another question that, as I said, was made online for Eihab, Omaish, and Yamide Dagnet, but we're going to put it to the entire panel. Based on the discussion that we have today, what elements do the panelists think are most needed to be emphasized in this new vision of the rule of law? And how do you see a new vision applying to all the major global challenges not addressed in depth today for instance, conflict and peace building and the protection of biodiversity. So I'm going to ask the entire panel to answer. I mean, if we could do basically or briefly so everyone can have a shot at answering the questions. So we're going to start with Mr. Omaish, please, if you can provide answers to the two questions. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I'll be quick and just to, I think I mentioned some of the elements that could answer this question in my intervention, and I will go over them very quickly again. So the way to ensure that is to make sure that the new vision, and this is what we're working on, serves as a foundation for sustaining peace. And we're building here on the pillars that are in the Charter, they're not in the nations. Serves as foundation for sustaining peace, respect for human rights, attainment of the SDG, the social development goals, and also, and this was mentioned by different speakers, the infodemic put an end to the infodemic pandemic that is plaguing the whole world now, to tackle corruption, to ensure gender equality, and to work on the protection of our planet. I heard the first part of the question. I'm not sure I heard the second part of the question clearly. If you could either repeat it, or I'm not sure if this will cover the points in the question.
Yeah, yes, of course. The second part of the question was, how do you see a new vision applying to other major global challenges not addressed in depth today? For instance, conflict and peace building and the protection of biodiversity.
Yes, so, and this is in preparation of the outline of the new vision or the renewed vision of the rule of law, by ensuring the respect for human rights, the sustaining peace, and all of the other elements that we put in the outline that was developed by all partners who are working on the rule of law, we will try to tackle those issues. As I said before, we cannot handle this from only one side, which is the rule of law. This is one part of a big puzzle that has to work together to achieve that. Now, in the new vision, also, we made sure that it includes a chapter on the protection of our planet. And on this, by saying this, to deal with the big challenges that we are facing because of climate change and the climate issues. I'll stop here to give also a chance for other panelists to intervene as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I move now to Mrs. De Meo. Maybe you want to also briefly address the question, and then we'll move to Ambassador Round.
Great, thank you. I actually think that most of my original intervention really addressed the issue of some of the elements of the new vision. And of course, I was focusing on some of those emerging issues related to technology. So I don't want to repeat that, just to say that it is an opportunity, it is a tool, and we still have to have the individuals involved. And it's the individuals that balance out the potential downsides of using technology. But this use of emerging technologies really creates a lot of opportunities for the new vision. And I think that's really important. I also wanted to address, the first question had to do with the role of academics. You know, UNIDROIT is actually a research and training institute, and we are a bridge with academics. We have our own LLM program, and we have a very wide networks of academics. So I have to really agree with the question that it's very important to be engaging academics. The role of research, really qualitative, quantitative, in-depth research cannot be left aside, because that's the foundation for all of the advances that we're able to take, whether it's the rule of law or whether it's environmental issues or any other issues that are going on. So I completely agree that engaging with academics is critical, and being able to build upon the lessons and the results of their research. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ambassador Ruthström-Ruin, I mean, I don't know if you could hear both questions. It's your turn if you did. If not, I can try to repeat them.
Thank you so much, Chair. And I have had some difficulties hearing, and I also don't see you. I don't know if you can see me.
Yeah, yes, we can see you. We can see you.
Good, good. So let me just then make 2 points, since I'm not really sure whether I captured all of the discussion. But picking up on the last point and the need for involving academia, let me just emphasize the need for an evidence-based approach, both to our discussion and to the policy making. From our point of view, showing the case for democracy, the case for the rule of law is actually key to be able to go to what we also need, namely building the political momentum. And I think the executive director of UNODC referred to that in her opening remarks, that we actually do have the platforms, and we need to ensure political momentum by working with governments, and the evidence-based approach, I think, is key. We need a multifaceted approach. I will not pick out one component, but I would like to highlight the importance of young persons, because the youth is really the future if we are going to build inclusive, sustainable societies, and societies with increasing trust, and where rule of law and democracy can be respected. So everything that we can do to include the young persons in a meaningful way, I think should be in focus. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to give now the floor to the all speakers here, starting from the left, and I will encourage you all, if you can stick to 1 minute each, then we can make it in time for a break and for the next session. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Chair. I react only on the first question, adding one personal opinion and a reference to official document. The first one is considering the role of academia strategic today. It is not only to complete a platform of shareholders, but for the sense we recognize to academia to prepare the future generations. The ultimate scope of new corruption is to make that the society will accept it as a necessary evil. The ultimate scope of liquid corruption is to prepare the basis for a cultural acceptance of corruption. The academia is the only key actor to prepare society and future generation to avoid this danger. And we in the G20 anti-corruption working group, in every last document adopted, every time we refer to civil society and other non-governmental actors, we have inserted officially the term academia in every principle and article, taking into due account this threat. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In my intervention, actually, I mentioned, the importance of, university as sustainable organizations, and especially to collect, manage, and use data. I've been, it's absolutely important, in the context of climate change, and you could have institutional framework set up to recognize their role in climate bill, as we can see in the world. And I would just say that there are emerging South-South collaborations of university. One was launched by Bangladesh with least developed countries, so I can come back to you. And I would say that it's very important also to think about protection. After the release of the latest IPCC report, it's deplorable to see that some scientists were actually imprisoned, when they were trying to make also their case. Lastly, on the vision for biodiversity, I would like to highlight, I mentioned the fact that Panama had just enacted a rights of nature law, joining a few other countries in embracing a legal approach that gives land, trees, rivers, coral reefs, mountains, unique legal rights, similar to human corporations and governments. That's a new way, to bring those who have no voices here, to the core.
Yes, thank you. For the new vision of the rule of law, in addition to what was emphasized by the panelists, I'd like to highlight again the importance of needing to bring justice closer to the people. If we are able to make justice systems more responsive to the needs of the people, we can help empower them and give them effective tools to both protect their rights, but also fight some of the global challenges such as the climate change. And of course, for the question on academia, academia is a trusted partner for the OECD. In many of our global roundtables and platforms for dialogue, academia is again is an active participant and contributor, but also as the organization committed to evidence-based policy making, we certainly draw a lot of analysis and insights from the academic work. Thank you so much for that.
On academia, I simply share 100% what was said by Tartaglia Polcini, and I fully agree. And being a professor of law myself, I really share everything on the relevance of culture and universities. But I would like to go to the second question in the sense that I think for all what I've heard today, I think we should also address the issue of global law and the fact that some of the phenomena are territorial. Here we discuss a lot, of course, of domestic legislation, but when you speak of all the pandemia and all what happened for access to vaccines and also artificial intelligence and platforms are all phenomena that cannot be only regulated in terms of social effects, in terms of protection of information on everything. They change the structure of the market and they change the issue. So I would say territoriality and global law as a relevant issue. I think this is really the new issue to tackle at this stage, in my understanding.
Just two thoughts. First, to your question about academia. Civil society organizations actually ask really interesting questions, and we've worked with academia on that. For example, there's one question that we asked at Twaweza in East Africa: are our children learning? Lots of investments in building buildings and hiring teachers, but actually are the kids learning? And we went through an elaborate process of answering that question, and it was a pretty terrifying answer. So we're trying to deal with that challenge through randomized controlled trials of an intervention that we are actually wanting to scale up in Tanzania. So we have also looked at citizen behavior. So here we're working very closely with civil society, with academia. Another civil society organization based in Kampala in Uganda called Raising Voices has done some really interesting work on reducing gender-based violence, again with academia. And I think what they found, a model that is working, they're actually helping the FCDO to scale up and use this around the world. So I think that nexus can be very fertile indeed. On the second issue about the sort of the new vision for the rule of law, about 18 years ago, I came across a categorization of problems that was really quite interesting. There are tame problems, there are wicked problems, and there are crises, right? Tame problems, hard, but you have solutions. There's a formula, you manage it. Wicked problem actually deals with degrees of severity, and there isn't a clear answer at the end of it. You just have to manage degrees of severity. And then there are crises which require a response. And I think we've all been through this COVID crisis, which has required some response. But the OGP looked at the crisis issue, but a crisis doesn't stay a crisis forever. It becomes then a wicked problem. And that's the challenge, I think, of recovering from COVID-19 and all of the other things that it brought up as challenges. So there's open response, open recovery, open renewal as some of using open government principles that can really help deal with this. But I want to end with, again, a challenge. I think a wicked problem that we're all facing is that the very idea of the centrality of the rule of law itself has been questioned and continues to be questioned. What are we doing about that? And this is not just a legal problem. This is a political, sociological, economic problem. How are we going to address that questioning of the very idea of the rule of law?
Thanks a lot for the questions. As a think and do tank, as we like to define ourselves, we consider that there is a strong need to bridge the worlds of policy and academia. But I think also, having worked in the past at the OECD, that we have to be aware of the fact that research is also funded sometimes with an agenda, which is perhaps not so independent. So there is a very important element there that we have to address. We have to draw a distinction between evidence-based research and policy-driven research. And as long as we guarantee the robustness of the analysis, then we can say that we may provide and get from the academia that sort of evidence-based analysis. I would like also to echo what was said by Yamide about the fact that academia is not only from the North. We have to engage and support conversations across regions and within regions. There is a lot of knowledge relevant for policy making out there that is simply not captured in global fora and global circles. And we have to bring to bear that analysis that is already available simply because of some barriers, could be linguistic barriers or simply barriers of access to those policy circles. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to all of you for your succinct and incredibly thoughtful contributions. And this has been a great panel, I think. I mean, thank you so much to all of the speakers, both online and the ones present here. And apologies to all of them for the way we torture them with the signs saying you have 1 minute or your time is over, or for the interruption. It's always a challenge to manage this amount of speakers. So it was very, very stimulating. I think we're all taking a number of important takeaways from this panel. We will report back on what we believe to be the main conclusions in the reporting session. For now, I thank you all for your enthusiasm and your questions and your attention. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then at 5 to 4, we will reconvene here for the final session of the conference. So thank you all.